Good morning and good afternoon and good evening or night. My name is Ryan Lange, and together with my colleague Anna Maria Urbanova from the Corax Foundation, today we'll have a match from the Inter-University Law Debate Tournament, 8th edition, and between two teams, one team, University of Melbourne, Australia, and the University of Manitoba in Canada. So I give the floor to my colleague who will be hosting the match.
Thank you very much, and indeed, good day to, of course, our participants and also the esteemed three judges that will be reviewing this match, and of course, everyone else that might be watching us live or later on record. So, apologies. Today is one of the very last matches of the group phase, but also one of the matches that were postponed from the early weeks of the competition, so the day one of the group phase matches. So between the University of Melbourne and the University of Manitoba, we'll hear today arguments on whether or not the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in international law should be upheld to impose lesser obligations on developing countries to combat climate change. So, of course, the teams received the topic still 7 days in advance, although it's one of the postponed matches. But before we hear more on the arguments, let's hear more on the teams. So for introductions, passing the floor first to University of Melbourne's team, Ms. Sweeney.
Good morning and good evening, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Isabella and I'm very happy to be here.
Welcome, thank you. For University of Manitoba, Mr. Tarun Sandhu.
My name is Taryn, first-year student at the University of Manitoba. Really excited to be here and talk about this super engaging topic with my international friends.
Thank you and welcome. From University of Melbourne, Ms. Stephanie Brennan.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Steph. I'm a second-year JD student here at the University of Melbourne. I'm very excited to be here and debating on such an interesting and important topic in international law.
You're welcome. From the University of Manitoba, Ms. Nav Nain.
Hi, I'm Nav, and I'm a second-year law student at the University of Manitoba, and I'm excited for the debate.
Thank you. Welcome from University of Melbourne, completing your three-member team, Mr. Isaac Flake.
Hello, everyone. My name is Isaac Flake. I'm a second-year law student at the University of Melbourne. Really grateful to have the opportunity to meet you all and excited for the debate. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Well, completing the three-member team of University of Manitoba, Mr. Cole Cornies.
Hi all, I'm Cole, first-year student at the U of M Faculty of Law, and looking forward to the debate, and it's awesome to meet you all from all the way over here.
And welcome. Of course, also warm welcome and hello to the mentors and supporters of the teams for University of Melbourne. If I'm not mistaken, it's Professor Heritage. So also passing the request from our organization to the support, of course, from all the teams and supporters that might have aided you on the journey. And as always, after the allocation of the positions that my Philippe will briefly share on his screen, we'll have 5 minutes to final preparation, and the team in favor will then start with the opening statement.
Yes, so I will share my screen. You will see in a few seconds a wheel with yes, double flags and logos of the institutions you are representing. So as you can see, there are two chances, one chance to be in favor, one chance to be against. And the team will be in favor, out of this randomizing, will be starting with the first introduction. For this match, it will be the University of Melbourne will be in favor of the motion, while, as a consequence, it will be the University of Manitoba will be against the motion. Concretely, it means that the University of Melbourne will defend the position that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in international law should be upheld to impose less obligations on developing countries to combat climate change. while the principle of common but differentiated, the University of Manitoba will defend the position that the principle of common and but differentiated responsibilities in international law should not be upheld, but to impose less obligations on developing countries to combat climate change. So now you will have 5 minutes to review your notes, and then we'll hear the team from the Australian team. here we are done with the 5 minutes of preparation.
We'll start soon by hearing the opening statements. So just a short reminder also for our audience, yellow card indicates 30 seconds left of speaking time, whereas the red card indicates the speaking time being up. So without further ado, the debate team of University of Melbourne, you have 4 minutes for your opening statement in favor.
I will begin speaking in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, esteemed judges, members of the opposing delegation, and to my fellow colleagues. My name is Steph, and I'm the first speaker for the delegation in favour of the motion. We argue that imposing lesser obligations on developing countries, which, by implication, imposes larger obligations on developed ones, is an appropriate practical elaboration of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and is the correct solution to combating climate change moving forward. We will qualify this with 2 main points. First, that it reflects and caters to the reality of our current state system. And secondly, that it is already a normative principle that states are willing to abide by. I'll begin by defining the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle recognises that while all states have a role to play in pursuing a common goal, in this context combating climate change, they should assume differing obligations in achieving that goal, depending on their socio-economic context and their historical contribution to the problem, here, the environmental state of the planet. The first tenet of our argument is that the principle and its translation into practice by imposing lesser obligations on developing states recognises that all states have a part to play in addressing the urgent threat of climate change, but the main responsibility lies with developed states when considering developing states' current capacity to address climate change. The reality is that not all states have the same capacity to engage in activities to mitigate climate change, either by reducing domestic emissions or participating in intergovernmental schemes. When you consider that it is the developed states that are contributing the most to rising global emissions, yet developing ones are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change, it is a natural conclusion that they should not be held to the same standards. In 2023, China contributed to 31% of total global emissions, yet Tuvalu is sinking year by year and might disappear altogether in the near future. To address climate change effectively, we need a model that allows the common goal of addressing it to be reached, while considering the main issue with non-compliance is not political will, but lack of capacity. This is where the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities comes in, and its translation into imposing lesser obligations onto developing states. This framework accommodates state interests and needs, while recognising that we cannot wait for developing states to catch up. Climate change is a threat that is felt now, and it must be addressed now. Developing states, who are also the biggest climate polluters, have the capacity to contribute to compensate for the deficiencies of developing states. So we asked, why shouldn't there be varying levels of obligations? I will now move to the second element of our argument, principally that the principle and consequent imposition of lesser obligations on developing states already has significant normative pull, and so continuing to uphold the principle will lead to strengthened climate cooperation and genuine change. The principle is already reflected in several international climate instruments, both explicitly by name, as seen in the Rio Declaration, Paris Agreement, and the UNFCCC, and through obligations echoing the principle, such as in the Montreal Protocol and the Stockholm Protocol. This demonstrates its already established place in international law. Moving into the future, the principle does not seem to be losing any of its normative pull. If we take the Netherlands and Uganda case, for example, it was found that the Dutch government's 2020 emissions reduction target under the Paris Agreement was inadequate when considering climate science and policy requirements. In this case, it was explicitly acknowledged that developed states must take the lead by assuming larger obligations to allow developing states to assume lesser ones in line with their capacities. The fact that the principle is being applied in jurisprudence further shows its entrenched place in the international sphere, and indeed provides approval of the fact that it is an effective way of catering for the practical difference in state capacities. Ultimately, we've argued the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and its translation into imposing lesser obligations on developing states is a logical, effective way of addressing the problem of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear the opening statement for the against position by the debate team of University of Manitoba. You have 4 minutes.
Good day to the judges and to my colleagues from Melbourne. My name is Taryn, and I'm here with Cole and Nav. We will be arguing why the motion should fail. Common but differentiated responsibility was first pronounced at the Earth Summit in 1992. It was a good idea. Different countries contributed different amounts and had different capacities. Everyone had a part to play, but that part should be respective of the understanding of their capacity. The world has changed since 1992. In 1992, global warming was less than half a degree above the pre-industrial average. We then set a goal for ourselves to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, in 2024, we failed. 2024 was the hottest year on record and the first year our average global warming was above 1.5 degrees Celsius. What this means is what we are doing is not working. This is evident in our emissions. Last year, we set a record high, an estimated 41.6 billion tons of CO2. The source of this increase is evident. China, India, and other developing countries have been increasing their emissions, not decreasing them. The World Economic Situation and Prospects 2025 UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs is what defines China and India as developing countries. And in 2023, China's fossil fuel emissions went up 458 million metric tons. India's went up 233 million metric tons. This is the change, not the total. This year, both countries' emissions are again projected to increase. China and India might be the biggest polluters, but part of that reason is they are the most developed of developing countries. If more countries industrialize in the same manner, the problem will worsen. What will it look like 30 years from now when countries in Africa and Asia start reaching the levels India and China are at right now? If greater obligations for sustainable development are not put in place, the world will continue to accelerate towards climate disaster. Yet, the proponents of the motion wish to uphold the status quo. Their motion should not be supported, because while it feels good to pass the blame for global warming onto developed countries, global warming does not care who emitted the CO2. The effect is global. The sea levels will rise everywhere, have no jurisdictions, and earthquakes do not recognize our borders. Furthermore, it is developing countries that primarily suffer from climate change. Richer countries can insulate themselves, either by their geography, their resources, or their capacity to adapt. The status quo has been failing for 30 years, and if it continues to fail, the global poor will pay the price far sooner than developed countries. Now, this is not to say that global cooperation cannot exist in this fight against climate change. Developing countries benefit from the investment, knowledge, and skills developed countries have accumulated in years past. China and India, for example, are climbing the tech tree faster than Europe and the US. Money, technology, and skills have been pouring out of rich countries and into developing ones, but it is clear that if those countries have lesser obligations on them, they will continue to increase emissions. Even more concerning, if lesser obligations are maintained, then richer countries might cut off involvement entirely. Notably, the US has once again pulled out of the Paris Agreement. By imposing greater obligations on developing countries to develop sustainably, they can reduce their emissions while maintaining global cooperation. This does not mean that developing countries should let their citizenry remain impoverished for the sake of the climate. What it means is that we must play to our strength. Richer countries can continue to leverage their more advanced economies, research institutions, and capabilities in order to synthesize new technologies. However, developing countries should also face greater obligations to develop sustainably. The technology and resources of richer countries must be used to keep emissions down. This is not only possible, in some situations, it is practical. Thank you.
Thank you. We have now heard the opening statements from both sides of the argument. We'll now proceed to the rebuttals. For the first rebuttal in favor position, University of Melbourne, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. While the opposing delegation may argue that the world has changed and we're in a new position with regards to the state of emissions, we would like to remind the opposing delegation that there are states whose capacity has not changed. And I refer back to our central argument that this motion is about the logical and practical extrapolation of a fundamental principle of international law, and that the application of this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is what will allow states to assume obligations that they can meet in combating climate change with genuine efficacy. I'd like to touch on the point that
of developing nations and what we would classify as a rich or poor country. We would like to specify and clarify with the argument that we need to be clear when we speak about a developing nation, we don't just mean states that, by virtue of their GDP, are in a weaker position than large industrialized nations, which we would argue does include such states as China or India. We're including in these discussions states that have already been adversely impacted to such a significant degree by climate change, to take Tuvalu, as my first speaker said, or Vanuatu. We want to highlight that these are states that are unable to contribute in the same way as other such large nations, and that therefore to impose a uniform system is unrealistic. I'd also like to point out that we've had successful climate agreements before, to take the Montreal Protocol and the 1985 Ozone Convention, which was also based on a similar principle of common but differentiated responsibilities due to the nature of the issue, which is the same today. It is not possible to have a system based on, is it not possible to have a system based on voluntary, flexible commitments? We already know that the Paris Agreement and mandatory obligations has failed in the past, based on the Kyoto Protocol, and that the Paris Agreement was established for the purpose of addressing that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear the first rebuttal in the against position. University of Manitoba, you two have 2 minutes.
Wonderful. Quick mic check. Everyone can hear me, yes? Excellent. All right, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Good evening to the judges and to my opponents. I'd like to take my time to highlight how the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, while perhaps reasonable in past years, is no longer reasonable when considering the severity of the climate emergency. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is the most significant climate agreement in the sphere of international law, with 195 ratifying parties. Part of the agreement outlines carbon output targets that must be met to prevent the increase of global temperature from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to prevent the most severe impacts of climate change. The goals of the Paris Agreement are currently not being met. According to the 2023 Global Stocktake, the globe's efforts have been insufficient. We are not on track to meet the agreement's long-term goals, and the opportunity to correct these shortcomings is limited. We need to explore ways of improving our contributions towards the goals of the agreement if we want to mitigate climate disaster. It's for this reason that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities should no longer be upheld. The data on carbon emissions is clear. Developing nations are significant contributors. For example, India contributes roughly 7.5% of the world's emissions alone, Indonesia 1.7%, Brazil 1.2%. We're in a situation where allowing developing nations to operate under lesser climate impact obligations is simply unsustainable, as to do so would allow the global climate situation to continue to approach crisis. Let me clarify, this is not to shift the entire burden onto developing nations. Developed nations remain the largest carbon emitters. The consideration is this: if we do not make a significant change in our approach to fighting climate change, we will fail, and that will mean an irreversible decline in the health of our planet. We must hold all nations to the highest standard if we are to have a chance of meeting the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. The time for allowing for lesser obligations has unfortunately passed. In conclusion, if the motion is upheld, we as a global community will be unable to meet the Paris Agreement goals. This is not an acceptable outcome. All countries must meet the agreement goals, and thus the motion should fail. Thank you very much.
You will now hear the second rebuttal for the in favor position. University of Melbourne, you have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Isaac, and I'll be presenting this rebuttal against the opposing delegation and for the motion. We acknowledge that the Paris Agreement has had ups and downs, and that not all of the goals of the Paris Agreement have been met, especially, forgive me, regarding the 1.5 Celsius temperature raise. However, we believe that to take a complete switch to the other side would be unwise at this point. For example, we believe that the best approach involves cooperation with the international community, not imposing higher obligations on developing countries. The opposing delegation would suggest that ensuring that developing countries have higher burdens and higher responsibilities is the way to go. However, even a brief look at history shows that with colonialism and the expansion of empires, that it's far too late in the day to continue imposing our wills on developing countries and cause them to answer for developed countries' problems. We want to take an approach here that will empower and uplift developing countries. And this is what the differentiated but common responsibilities principle does. It helps enable them and empower them. It brings them to have a seat at the table. Per the United Nations Charter, Article 1, one of the principles of international relations is that we're to act on the principle of equality between nations. And this is what the principle of differentiated but common responsibilities does. It helps empower them. For example, in the nationally determined contribution statements of Afghanistan and the Lao People Democratic Republic to developing nations, they have both expressed their willingness to do more when they're provided the support by developed countries and by other nations. In the same way, when there's that differentiated responsibilities, it gives the opportunity for those who want to contribute to have part, but also opens up room for collaboration and empowerment between different nations as we support each other as an international community. We would like to argue that this is the best way to go, and that through having a strategy that reflects common cooperation between international relations, we will be able to best address this issue. Thank you.
We'll now hear the second rebuttal by University of Manitoba. You have 2 minutes. You're muted.
Microphone. Yeah.
Microphone.
Sorry. Hi, I'll start my argument in 3, 2, 1. So the opposing team has pointed out that principles of CBDR should be upheld due to capacity issues and its reflection of the current realities. However, and also due to the historic responsibility associated with climate change and the climate crisis. I would respectfully disagree with that. The principle of CBDR is based on the idea that imposing equal obligation on developing countries will stifle their economic growth. However, this argument is based on the idea that industrialization must follow the same carbon-intensive path taken by developed countries. But we have seen with that sustainability and sustainable development and economic growth can coexist, as illustrated by nations like Costa Rica and Morocco that are successfully pursuing green energy transitions while also maintaining economic growth. Moreover, a lot has changed since the developed nations began industrializing in the late 18th century. There's more technological advancements and greater knowledge about climate change and the impact of human activities. Simply speaking, we know better. So argument of historical responsibility should fail on those grounds. Imposing lesser obligations on developing nations would mean allowing them to continue making the mistakes that have brought the Earth into its current state of climate crisis and making the issue worse, despite greater technological advancements and knowledge. According to Global Carbon Atlas, China and India, which are developing nations, are among the top carbon emitters today. Lesser obligations don't just maintain the current climate crisis, they allow developing countries to increase emissions, accelerating its worsening impact. Therefore, the urgency and global nature of the climate crisis demands a unified approach where all nations contribute meaningfully, irrespective of their level of development. And additionally, placing equal obligations ensures greater action and priority. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear the concluding statements, starting with the position in favor. University of Melbourne, you have 2 minutes.
I would first like to thank the opposing delegation for the discussion of this important issue. I would like to reiterate our delegation's support for the proposed motion on the grounds that upholding the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities through imposing lesser obligations on developing states is a practical and logical solution to addressing climate change as a common, urgent issue in a world where not all capacities are equal. This is because it reflects and caters to the reality of our current state system, where developing states are both less positioned to contribute to mitigation efforts, yet often more affected by climate change. And secondly, it is already a normative principle that states are willing to abide by. I would like to acknowledge the arguments made by the opposition, who would seek to argue that we should not uphold the status quo and it is failing us. And although we acknowledge the shortcomings of the Paris Agreement, this principle of common but differential responsibilities, its application allows states to meet obligations that they can actually meet. The reality is that imposing a principle of equality rather than equity is unrealistic. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that the opposing delegation has argued that developing nations are indeed a big part of the problem and is unsuitable to impose lesser obligations, and this time has passed. They've also sought to argue that we cannot continue to allow developing countries to make the same mistakes. But this is relying on a definition of developing states as found in the Kyoto Protocol in the Annex 1. We can see the change between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement in the voluntary self-determination targets, that this concept of developing states is no longer as rigid. We acknowledge that states, it is a much more multifaceted issue than it was in the Kyoto Protocol, and we want to empower developing countries, and we want to ensure that those most affected by climate change, such as Vanuatu and Tuvalu, are not missed and indeed might be sunk just because we are concerned with certain states that we perceive as worsening the problem. Thank you. I rest our case.
Thank you for your submission. We'll now hear the concluding statements by University of Manitoba. You have 2 minutes.
I'd like to thank the opposition for their submissions and their remarks, and to point out, to just jump on something, it's the common imposing lesser obligations empowers. Not imposing lesser obligations allows for a more broader spectrum and for states to meet where they are on that spectrum of developing to developed, and that will allow for countries like China to not be in the same classification as countries that you've pointed out that would suffer dramatically from climate change. And now moving on to my submission. We've seen that the CBDR and its principles of imposing lesser obligations on developing countries is ineffective, harmful, and will result in losing the fight against climate change. We've seen its ineffectiveness in China and India, who continue to grow their emissions. We know that this rise will disproportionately affect the developing nations who are vulnerable. And we have measured the 30-year history of CBDR and voluntary approach repeatedly failing to limit global warming, from less than half a degree to reaching the 1.5 degrees just last year. This is why we can't leave the issue to be voluntary. And in conclusion, we can either support the motion and continue playing the blame game, continue polluting our home faster and faster towards disaster, or we can recognize that while we all have a different level of responsibility in getting here, we have the same obligation to protect our home. We tried fighting climate change like our economy depends on it. We lost. It's time to start fighting like our lives depend on it, because they do. We are at a stage in this fight where it does not matter how we share the burden. It matters that we carry it. Thank you.
Thank you for your submission. This now concludes the end of your debate. You can now relax. You're no longer graded after this part. So congratulations on concluding your group race matches. What a journey. And even if your day one is the last match of your group phase, it's still congratulations from our side. Well done on researching, on presenting your arguments and adjusting also for the positions. So really just congratulations. As tradition would have it for us, let's do a short round of feedback on how it was for you during the debate, how was the research, perhaps how was the group phase itself, if you found a certain dynamic within your team, and if you have if you have research topics that were already familiar to you. So perhaps starting with the University of Melbourne, Miss Sweeney, how was it?
Hi everyone, congratulations on the debate. I think this round's been quite interesting because, I mean, we've had a bit of time to get to know each other and familiarise ourselves with the process, and it's also a topic that we, I think, are all a lot more familiar with and more in touch with, so it allowed us to approach it in a slightly different way, and I think it was more challenging in a sense because we came at it with our own opinions and ideas, so we were very
I would say on edge, but we're anticipating what side we'd end up having to argue because I think we all have our own like arguments in the back of our mind. But it was definitely an interesting but challenging one to prepare for.
Thank you. For University of Manitoba, Mr. Sandhu, how was it for your team?
Like you mentioned, it was a topic that was a little bit more, I don't know, intuitive, I guess, in compared to the banking one we had last time. So it was a little bit more intuitive, and I think it was kind of better for it because it felt like the arguments came a little more naturally. It was easier to think on the fly for some of the things, but it also led to more points of, I think it was, China and India, whether they classify as developed or developing, and that was a point we had to argue that we weren't actually expecting. When you only go from your side, you don't expect it to be that contentious an issue, but it turns out to be one, and I think that made it really interesting. So thank you guys for that.
We're preparing University of Melbourne, Mr. Flake, how was it?
I think preparing for this one was a great opportunity to learn more about the international law system, and not only the law side of things, but also just what's going on in the world and what's been done in this area. And I think that it is an area which is driven by, you do see in the world a lot of passion regarding this subject, and I think that sort of feeds itself into the debate. So I think this was an exciting one. Yeah, thank you.
Hearing, from University of Manitoba, Ms. Nine, how was it?
Oh, I had a great time with this debate, preparing for it and also executing it. It was one of those, in terms of the process, since this is our second debate, I was more familiar with the process, so it's not as nerve-wracking in that sense. The first one kind of threw me off a little bit in the process, but felt better with this one. Yeah, and it was an exciting topic, and I learned a lot during the preparation about international law and environmental law, for sure. It was a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. For University of Melbourne, Ms. Brennan, how was it?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what everyone else has said. It's a very, obviously a issue that's at the front of a lot of consciousness at the moment. So it was very interesting to be able to debate on it. But in terms of it's such a nuanced issue and having to either be really hard for or against, was interesting trying to negotiate those nuances and also be able to anticipate the nuances that the opposing side would bring up, because yeah, this isn't completely settled in literature. Most literature goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like a debate. So it was very interesting, that aspect, trying to come up with very convincing arguments either for or against. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Mr. Kulkarnis for University of Manitoba.
Yeah, I found this debate this was super fun. The topic was great. Like my colleague mentioned, our previous one was on international banking law, which is, don't get me wrong, very interesting, but not quite as emotionally attached to kind of the common, what would you even say, even everything from the news cycle to things that keep you up at night. So it was great fun being able to kind of engage and prepare an argument for both sides. And I found that in preparing the arguments, you really could argue for a very similar outcome through what is effectively different means. So I thought it was really neat because there's a lot of similarities between the two, and all in all, it was great fun to prepare and also to present. And I think you guys did great. So yeah, it was fun. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing. Apologies. Is full season in Europe. I'm so sorry. I'll have to pass the floor to my colleague.
Yes, sorry. And yes, so congratulations in general for this match. Now we'll be doing a bit of networking as well. And I will ask you a question particularly to know simply out of all the topics you already had, the two match, if there is one maybe you'll be more in favor to do more studies or even pursue a career, or maybe a totally different topic that you are more interested in your studies currently, in your law studies. So I will ask each of you simply to tell me which kind of professional ambition you would have after your studies. So we start with Miss Sweeney.
In terms of, oh God, I think I'm more interested in like the environmental side of things, and like I forgot to say this initially, but I'm a second year student at Melbourne, so I'm having to start to think about these things, and I think it is like the environmental law side of it, particularly in Australia, is something I would like to be more involved with and engage with when I graduate, because I think it's important and it's particularly like relevant in this country.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Mr. Sandhu?
I think what engages me about these topics is maybe less the international law side of it. It's more the environmental issues, like you mentioned. Especially here in Canada, we have a lot of criminal environmental regulations as well on companies. And I think, I don't know, it just kind of makes me feel good to be the kind of lawyer that could, go after companies that are breaking regulations or polluting our home and resulting in damage to all of us. And there's an international component to that because a lot of pollution happens in sea or, like we talked about, space. And so being able to address that would be really cool and a feel-good thing to do.
Okay, good to know. Miss Brennan?
Yes, so here in Australia, we don't have quite that level of environmental protection. It's a very politicized issue and one that a lot of elections are hinging on. So we see a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's such a major domestic political issue. But I'm very interested in the climate litigation that's developing over here, especially where we are in Victoria. We are seeing very interesting strategic litigation on climate, running things through tort law for duty of care. We have a charge of human rights just here in Victoria. We don't have one for the whole country, and seeing some cases against the government in breach of human rights. It's a very, very interesting area of law, and very keen to explore the ways that it goes.
Okay, good to know. Mr. Cornish?
Yeah, I'm probably it seems to be the only one that's perhaps in career scope relating a little more to a different topic, which is the banking one. I'm kind of on the corporate commercial track at the moment, so that kind of thing, business transactions, I think, and working with business is super, super interesting. So I guess a little bit of a different answer because I'm not entirely sure I could see myself practicing in environmental law. A lot of the environmental law jobs here in Canada, my understanding is you're effectively representing big oil because we have a huge oil industry that, of course, kind of bumps heads with the more strong regulations that my colleague mentioned. So I don't know if I could do that. It's a bit of a tough tack to have to take to fight against the environment. But yeah, that's kind of the answer there.
Okay, understand. Mr. Flake?
Yeah, so one of my interests, something I'm really passionate about, is international trade and foreign investment. And so when I was preparing the against the motion side of this, something that I was looking at were alternatives to the differentiated but common responsibility system. Alternatives, meaning I was looking at projects where, in like a regional sense or country to country, bilateral, they were already doing these things, investing in green projects or an environmentally friendly infrastructure. And I think that's something that was really exciting in the research that I did. And I think that that sort of combined with my passion with international transactions and investment in that sense. So that was really exciting for me.
Okay, good. And Miss Nain?
Yeah, so my main interest in terms of pursuing as a career is civil litigation. And I enjoy the international law aspect of, research in this area. And it was exciting, it was interesting to learn more about how nations are working through this common issue. And I find that international law as an area is not as solidified. So it just always kind of creates this element of like how to make things work. And it's interesting how countries are doing it. So I always enjoy learning more about that.
Okay. In any case, what is important is that you keep contact if you want, of course, but because this competition is as well to make connections through all the teams all around the world. So I hear environmental, business, commercial, trade. I mean, in the future, you never know if you need a contact in the other country in order to move some cases or to get some contacts simply for some practitioners. So please do not hesitate, of course, to connect. We'll have a networking event as well with all the teams. That will be in the second part of April. That is what we are preparing at this moment while we are compiling the results. And finally, we have a very last question for this session. So this is a question that we gave in day one. So it means weeks ago for the teams when they were starting as well the competition. So in case your opponents, I mean the opposing team, is visiting you in your city, in your state, let's say, in your province even, what would be the first food or drink they should try? So in Winnipeg or in Melbourne? So I've been in Melbourne, I've never been in Winnipeg, but not far I've been, yes. So what would be, for example, if I ask to the team in Australia, what would be the very first food or drink that you would advise to try to the team from Canada when they will come to Australia?
We'd recommend, like in Melbourne, coffee culture is very much a thing, and it's a pretty good, I would say. I haven't traveled much, but by comparison, like that's something I'd highly recommend. Pretty much any cafe will have lots of options, things you can pick from.
We have a nice few gelato places as well around Melbourne.
Yeah. Little snacks, the little food and drink to get you through the day. Those are probably the ones we would recommend.
Okay, very good. And same question in Winnipeg, in case the team from Australia goes to the far north in Winnipeg, so what they should try?
I don't know if you guys know Cole or Nav. Do we have beaver tails? Is it at the Forks?
I know at Riding Mountain, but not sure about.
Ooh. I was
Beaver
thinking
tails
honey
are awesome.
dill.
Just raw
Honey
honey
dill
dill.
is honey. Well, you dip the wings in it, but it's like a sauce with. I'm new to Winnipeg myself, in fact, but this was what was recommended to me, so I can answer this question as the recipient of the recommendations. Honey dill on like wings, like chicken wings, is a sauce that is honey with dill. It's something else, but I will say it's pretty good, and every different kind of wing joint does it a little differently. You just don't want to buy the one in the store, like go to a restaurant and then dip some wings. And then you guys, I'm referring to my colleagues here who maybe know better than me, a burger that is a fat boy, which is to say a burger with chili on it. Am I right here? I had that recommended to me, and I think they're great, but I love chili. So
Yeah.
maybe burger with chili on it. Kind of crazy, and it does get everywhere, but if you are down for a messy meal, that's another recommendation.
Okay, good to know. So many thanks. We'll have to try Manitoba. And in any case, yes, this is a way as well you can connect. So we want to thank you for this match, especially because yes, you had to wait as well for the match to take place, and as well it was scheduled for weeks ago. So many thanks as well for your availability and as well for making it possible between 3 different countries and 2 different days, because it is already Tuesday in Australia. It's still in 10 minutes it will be Tuesday as well in the Netherlands. but yes, in any case, yes, we'll share with you the results from the 3 judges that we thank again for watching, maybe watching at this moment in the US. In UK it's a bit late, but in India it's very early. But in any case, many thanks for watching the match and assessing this match. And during the next days, we send you by email the results, and then after we publish as well on LinkedIn. So keep an eye on your email box, and as well you will get more information on the second part of the competition. First we'll have the mid-competition event, so that networking session between all the teams, and after it will be of course the 8th of finals for the 2 best teams of your group, and 2 best teams of all the other groups as well. So on our side, we wish you the best for the rest of the week as well, and we keep in touch by email, and you will know very soon the result of this match. Many thanks, Have a great
Thanks so much.
rest of the day, Monday in Canada, and have a good rest of Tuesday in Australia. Wish you the best. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.